My new neighbor, who had just moved in next door, called me over at midnight. Standing in the shadows, she looked at me sternly and said, "At exactly 11:00 p.m. tonight, bring your daughter to my back door. No lights. No noise. Trembling." I asked why, but she only replied, "You'll understand when you get there." When the time came, I held my fast-asleep daughter tight and crossed the yard between our houses. But the exact moment I looked back at my daughter's bedroom window from her second-floor room, I froze in absolute horror. Before we dive into the dramatic twists to come, thank you for being here. Your support means more than words can express. Leave a comment and let me know what city or state you're watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know who is on the other side of the screen, so I can send a personal hello. The alarm went off at 5:00 a.m. Just like every day, I reached out and silenced it before it could wake Lily. That was the first thing I did every morning, protect her sleep for just a few more minutes while I got ready. I walked down the hallway in the dark, knowing every creak of the floorboards by heart. The third board near the bathroom, the loose one right before the kitchen. 2 years of navigating this house alone had taught me things I never expected to learn. I turned on the stove and cracked 4 eggs into the skillet. Scrambled, just the way Lily liked them, soft in the middle, never browned. I had gotten really good at scrambled eggs. While the eggs cooked, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The maple tree we had planted together was taller now. It had survived 2 winters without anyone properly taking care of it. I suppose that made 2 of us. My name is Julia. I'm 30 years old. I live in a suburb of Chicago with my 5-year-old daughter, Lily. And for the last 2 years, it's just been the 2 of us. The divorce was finalized quietly, the way most painful things are. There was no huge screaming match at the end. No dramatic scene in a lawyer's office. There was just a stack of papers I signed on a Tuesday afternoon while Lily was at preschool. And then Luke was gone. Or rather, he had already been gone. He had left to work overseas almost 2 years prior, chasing some version of our future that I had stopped believing in long before the papers arrived. I put the toast on the plate next to the eggs and poured a small glass of orange juice. Then I heard the sound I lived for every morning. Little feet shuffling down the hallway. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway with her hair sticking up on one side, her teddy bear tucked under her arm. She blinked at me with her big brown eyes, still half asleep. And my chest did that thing. It always did. That sharp, full ache that I had no words for, except love. "Good morning, sweetie," I said. She shuffled over without answering and climbed into her chair. I slid the plate in front of her, and she picked up her fork with the slow, deliberate focus of a child who wasn't fully awake yet. I sat across from her and wrapped both hands around my coffee mug. The chair to my left was empty. It had been empty for 2 years. I thought about moving it to the garage more than once, but every time I tried, something stopped me. A stubborn, quiet part of me that just wasn't ready to rearrange the furniture around his absence. I didn't miss Luke. I told myself that every morning. What I missed was the idea of what we were supposed to be. The 4-legged table that had become a 3-legged one. And the daily exhausting work of pretending it was still stable. After breakfast, I got Lily dressed and walked her down the driveway to wait for the school bus. She waved at me from the window as the bus pulled away. And I waved back until it turned the corner. Then, I stood alone in the morning silence for a moment before heading back inside. The house belonged to my mother. She passed away 3 years ago and left everything to me. The house, her savings, the small investment portfolio she had carefully built over 30 years of working as a nurse. It wasn't a fortune by any means. But it was enough. Enough to pay the bills without drowning. Enough to give Lily stability. Even when everything else felt unstable, I kept the important documents in a small fireproof safe in my bedroom closet. The deed to the house. My mother's will. The bank statements. I checked on them every few months the way some people check on a sleeping child just to reassure myself they were still there. Me dad. Robert had a spare key to the house. I gave it to him 2 years ago when he offered to check in on us while Luke was away. He seemed genuinely concerned at the time. Coming over on weekends to fix a leaky bathroom faucet. Bringing groceries he claimed he accidentally bought too much of. I was grateful. I was alone and scared. And I needed someone looking out for me. And I needed someone so badly that I stopped paying attention to who that person actually was. My phone rang at 11:00 a.m. that morning while I was answering work emails. It was my dad. "Hey, sweetheart," he said. His voice warm and casual. The way it sometimes got when he wanted something. "I'm going to swing by this afternoon if that's all right with you." "Sûr," I said. "That's fine." "Great. Actually, there's someone I'd like you to meet. An old colleague of mine. Good man. I think you two would hit it off." I remember the slight hesitation I felt. A brief tremor of something I couldn't quite name. But my dad sounded cheerful and certain. The way he always got when he had made up his mind about something. And I had spent 30 years not questioning that certainty. "Okay," I said. "What time?" "Around 4:00 p.m. he said. "And Julia wears something nice." I put the phone down on the desk and stared at it for a moment. Then I told myself it was just a friendly visit. My dad was being thoughtful. My dad was trying to help. I was really good at telling myself things that weren't true. That afternoon, at 4:04 p.m., I heard a car pull into the driveway. I looked out the front window and saw my dad getting out of his sedan. He turned to wait for someone on the passenger side. I smoothed my hair, took a deep breath, and walked to the front door. When I opened it, the man standing behind my dad was smiling. He shook my hand first. That was the thing I remember most from those early days. The firm, unhurried handshake of a man who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. Not the quick, superficial grip people give when they're already thinking about something else. A real handshake. The kind that says, "I see you." His name was Richard. He was in his 30s. Well-dressed, without being flashy. Wearing a light blue open-collar shirt and dark pants that looked expensive without announcing it. He had an easy smile that reached his eyes. And he held eye contact for exactly the right amount of time. Not too long, which would feel aggressive. Not too short, which would feel evasive. Just long enough to communicate that he had your full attention. My dad introduced him as an old, trusted friend who worked as a financial consultant. He used the word good several times. A good man. A good career. A good person to know. My dad said the word, the way people do, when they want you to stop asking questions. I just didn't realize it at the time. I stepped back and let them in. Richard walked through my front door as if he had always belonged there. He looked around the entryway, the way people look at a room when they are genuinely interested in it. Rather than just being polite. His eyes moved to the photographs on the wall. The small ceramic pot of succulents on the windowsill that I had spent 3 weeks trying to keep alive after killing the previous 2. He smiled at the succulents. "Resilient plants," he said. "Good choice for a busy house." He asked questions that felt genuine. How long had I been in this neighborhood? Did I like it? Was the elementary school nearby any good? Because he had a colleague with a kid the same age looking to move to the area. Every question followed naturally from the last. It was the way conversation flows when someone is actually listening to your answers, instead of just waiting for their turn to speak. I found myself answering easily and fully, giving more detail than I usually offered to someone I had just met. My dad settled into the armchair in the living room, and I went to make coffee. I could hear them talking quietly while I moved around the kitchen. The private murmur of two people who know each other well, falling back into the rhythms of an old familiarity. There was something about the sound of voices filling the space that made the house feel different. Bigger, somehow. Or less hollow. Like a room that had been closed off for too long, and finally had air circulating through it again. Lily got home on the school bus at 3:30 p.m. I heard the front door. Then the familiar rush of little footsteps I could identify anywhere. The specific rhythm of a 5-year-old who moved through the world at top speed and saw no reason to slow down. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, backpack still on, her hair a little messy from the bus, scanning the room with those serious brown eyes. "There are people here," she said. "Come say hello." I told her. She considered this for a moment. Lily was always a child who made her own assessments about new situations before committing to them. She couldn't be rushed into an opinion. She walked into the living room with the careful, measured look 5-year-olds use when deciding if they trust someone, a mix between a scientist and a diplomat. She climbed into my dad's lap first, which was her established habit. It was her way of claiming familiar ground before exploring new territory. My dad put his arm around her automatically, but his eyes darted to Richard. And something passed between the two men that I didn't understand. And I didn't try to. Then Lily turned her serious brown eyes to Richard. He didn't talk down to her. That was the first thing I noticed. He didn't use the high-pitched voice or the exaggerated enthusiasm adults usually use for kids. That kind of performance kids always see right through because they have better instincts than we give them credit for. He just looked at her steadily, with the same attention he had given me, and asked what her teddy bear's name was. "Teddy," she said. He nodded slowly, with the gravity the question deserved. "Teddy. Strong name for a bear," he said. "Very reliable. The kind of name you can trust." Lily thought about this for a moment. Then she almost smiled. With Lily, almost was significant. She didn't give her smiles away for free. Within an hour, she was showing him her drawings, scattered across the coffee table in an arrangement that followed a logic only she understood. Within 2 hours, she had pulled him outside to show him how high she could go on the swing, which was currently her main measure of personal achievement. He stood at the edge of the yard, hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression I hadn't seen directed at my daughter in a long time. Not the performative delight visitors sometimes offered. Not the look of someone waiting to be released from the obligation of paying attention to a kid. This was something else. The expression of someone genuinely present. Genuinely interested in what this little person could do. When she ran back toward the house for a drink of water, she grabbed his hand on the way and pulled him along without asking. He let himself be pulled without hesitation, adjusting his stride to hers. Something not everyone thinks to do. I stood at the kitchen window watching all of this, and I felt something shift inside me. Something I had kept locked in a room for 2 years. Behind a door I told myself was better left shut. It moved just a little, like a piece of furniture shifting in a space you thought was settled. My dad appeared next to me. He stood close, looking out at the yard, his voice low. "He's good with her," my dad said. "He is." I agreed. My dad nodded. He kept his eyes on the yard. Richard was crouching down at Lily's level now, examining something she had found in the grass. Giving it the same serious attention he gave everything else. Something crossed my dad's face as he watched. A flicker of something I couldn't immediately name. His jaw clenched for a moment. So briefly, I almost missed it. Then he turned and picked up his coffee cup. I told myself it was just emotion. A father watching his daughter experience something good. Feeling the complicated, private pride of being the one who provided it. I was always good at finding the interpretation that required the least amount of fear. That night, after dinner, after Richard had helped clear the table and insisted on doing the dishes despite my protests. After my dad said his goodbyes and went home, I took Lily upstairs for her bath. Her 2 chapters of a book. And the inevitable negotiation about the nightlight. When I finally turned off the light and stood up to leave, she spoke from the dark. "Is Richard coming back?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "Why?" "I hope so," she said. Her voice was the soft, slow voice of someone 3/4 asleep. Words arriving, with the loose precision of a mind letting go of its grip on the day. She hugged Teddy tighter against her chest. "He told me we could have a special secret. Just him and me." A chill brushed past me. Small, cold, and quick there. And gone before I could properly feel it. "What kind of secret?" "Sweetie. The fun kind," she mumbled. "He said he'd tell me next time." I kissed her forehead. I straightened up. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in the dim light from the hallway. Her small, soft, unguarded face. Her hand resting loosely around Teddy's ear. Out in the hallway, I leaned my back against the wall. That little cold feeling brushed past me again. I sat with it, turning it over, trying to find its shape, trying to figure out if it was a gut instinct, or just the reflex anxiety of a woman who had been alone long enough to be suspicious of good things. Then I let it go. He was kind. Lily had laughed her real laugh. Not her polite one. My dad trusted him. Those were facts. And I was a person who dealt in facts. And those facts were enough. They had to be enough. I had no idea then how much time I would spend in the coming months wishing I had stayed in that hallway. Wishing I had gone back into her room. Scooped her up. Held her until morning. And never, ever let anyone near her again. But I didn't. I went back downstairs and poured Richard another cup of coffee. The moving truck arrived on a Saturday morning, which surprised me. The house next door had been empty for almost 8 months. A foreclosure, someone in the neighborhood had said. Though no one knew the details. I had gotten used to the dark windows, the overgrown shrubs, the feeling of absence on that side of the yard. So when I looked out and saw a truck backed into the driveway, and 2 men carrying boxes up the front steps, I felt something I didn't expect: relief. I stood at the kitchen window for a moment, just watching. A neighbor was a small thing. A light in a window next door at night. A car in the driveway. The ordinary sounds of another life being lived close by. I hadn't realized how much I missed those things until I saw the moving truck. And my chest did something it hadn't done in a while. It relaxed. I baked an apple pie that afternoon. It was my mother's recipe, the one I memorized by watching her make it every Thanksgiving until I was old enough to make it myself. I wasn't a particularly gifted cook, but I could make that pie. The smell of cinnamon and warm butter filled the kitchen while Lily sat at the table, drawing horses in her sketchbook. And for a little while, the house felt full of something good. Richard was over that afternoon. He and Robert were in the backyard with Lily when I wrapped up the pie and walked over to the house next door. I knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately, as if the woman inside had been waiting for someone. She was in her 60s. With short silver hair and eyes a particular shade of gray that seemed to change depending on the light. She wasn't a large woman. But something about the way she stood in the doorway made her look like someone who had never been intimidated a day in her life. "I'm Julia," I said, offering the pie. "I live right next door. Just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood." She looked at me for a moment before looking at the pie. Then she smiled. And her whole face changed. "I'm Claire," she said. "Come on in." I walked inside. The house smelled of fresh paint and cardboard boxes. But the front room was already more organized than mine had been in 2 years. Books lined an entire wall. A precise arrangement that told me she had done this before moving into unfamiliar places and making them functional quickly. She put a kettle on the stove. And we sat at her kitchen table. She asked about the neighborhood. The grocery store 2 miles east. Whether the street flooded when it rained hard. Practical questions. The questions of someone building a mental map of a new place. I told her what I knew. And without meaning to. I told her more. About Lily. About preschool. About the last 2 years. Figuring out what our life looked like now. Claire listened without interrupting. Which was rarer than people realize. "You raising her on your own?" she asked. "For now," I said. Which was the answer I always gave when I didn't want to explain the whole truth. She nodded slowly. She didn't offer the usual responses. The, "You're so strong," or, "She's lucky to have you," that people say when they don't know what else to say. She just nodded. And her gray eyes stayed on my face. Steady and observant. There was something about the quality of her attention that I hadn't encountered in a long time. Not sympathy. Exactly. But recognition. The look of someone who had faced difficult situations before. And understood that the correct response was simply to keep looking. Keep listening. And not look away. When I got up to leave, she walked me to the door. We stepped out onto the porch. And that was when she looked past me toward my backyard. Richard was pushing Lily on the swing. My dad stood nearby. Arms crossed. Watching them. Something about Robert's posture was rigid in a way I hadn't noticed from inside the house. Claire's gaze moved from Robert to Richard. It lingered there for a moment, motionless and precise, like a camera lens adjusting before focusing. Then it moved to Lily. "Your daughter," Claire said. "Is that her on the swing?" "That's her," I said. Claire didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "She is a beautiful child. Julia. Take good care of her." It sounded like a compliment. But something about the way she said it made it feel more like a warning. "Thanks for the company," she said. And went back inside. I walked back home across the yard. Richard waved when he saw me. And Lily yelled for me to see how high she was going. I waved back and forced a smile. At the edge of my porch, I turned and looked at the house next door. Claire was standing in a second-floor window. Her eyes weren't on me. They were on Richard. She was perfectly still, watching him push my daughter on the swing. Her arms were at her sides. And her head was slightly tilted. The way someone tilts their head when they are trying to see something more clearly. She wasn't curious the way a new neighbor is curious. She was focused. Deliberate. The way a person focuses when they are looking at something they already have a name for. And are simply confirming what they know. She didn't move until I went inside and closed my door behind me. I told myself she was just a sweet, nosy old lady adjusting to a new neighborhood. But her eyes never stopped moving. The dinner was perfect. The wine was perfect. Richard was perfect. I should have known by then. Nothing that perfect is real. It was a Friday night. 3 weeks after we met. Richard offered to cook, which surprised me. Most of the men I knew treated the kitchen like a foreign country. But he moved through mine with an easy familiarity. Finding the right pans without asking. Seasoning without measuring. Setting the table with Lily's favorite cup already in her spot before I even thought to ask. Lily sat on the counter and watched him cook. She narrated everything he did, like a sports commentator. And he responded to every observation with total seriousness. Never once losing his patience. When she accidentally knocked a dish towel onto the floor, he picked it up without a word and handed it back to her. I stood in the doorway and watched them. I thought about the word family. And how long it had been since that word felt like a real thing in this house. After dinner, I bathed Lily and read her 2 chapters of her book before she fell asleep. Teddy tucked under one arm, her mouth slightly open. I stood in her doorway for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. There was nothing I wouldn't do for that sound. When I went back to the living room, Richard had cleared the table and opened a second bottle of wine. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I wanted to." He said. "Sit down. You've been on your feet all day." I sat on the couch and accepted the glass he handed me. He settled into the armchair across from me. And we talked for a while about easy things. The neighborhood. A movie we had both seen. A book he was reading about the history of the American Southwest. At some point, I went to the kitchen to get water. And he offered to make me something else. A light cocktail. Just juice and a little rum. Something to help you relax. I said yes, without thinking much of it. He was in the kitchen alone for maybe 5 minutes. He came back with 2 glasses and handed me mine with that same easy smile. It was sweet. Slightly tart. Exactly the kind of thing I would have made for myself. I drank half of it as we kept talking. 20 minutes later, I felt it. Not dramatically. Not like in the movies. Just a heavy sensation around the edges of everything. A softening of the room. I blinked slowly. My thoughts felt like they were moving through warm water. "I'm sorry," I said, pressing my fingers to my forehead. "I think the wine caught up with me." Richard smiled gently. "You work hard. You deserve to rest." I put my glass down on the floor. I intended to stand up. To go to my bedroom. To be a responsible adult who doesn't fall asleep in front of guests. But the couch was so soft. And the room was so quiet. And I was so tired. I don't remember closing my eyes. He tried. In the months that followed, to recall the exact moment I fell asleep. If there was a sound I didn't register. If something in me felt wrong right before the darkness hit. But there was nothing. Just the conversation. And then morning. A clean break between one moment and the next. As if someone had reached in and simply removed several hours of my life. What I know now and didn't know then is that Richard sat in that armchair and waited. He had done this before. In other houses. With other women who trusted him too easily. He knew exactly how long to wait. When he was certain I wouldn't wake up. He stood. He walked to the entryway and reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. What he pulled out was small and flat. A magnetic card reader. The kind used to clone electronic locks. He placed it on the console table without ceremony. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a house key. A key to my house. Copied from the spare, my dad had given him weeks before I even knew Richard's name. He placed it next to the card reader. Flipping it once in his fingers as if confirming something to himself. Then he walked down the hallway. Toward my daughter's bedroom. I slept through all of it. I slept so deeply and so completely that I heard nothing. I didn't know then what a dangerous thing that was. Before I reveal the devastating retaliation this traitor is about to face. Leave a comment with the number 10 below to let me know you're still here and supporting Julia. Your presence means everything. And please note, the upcoming chapters contain fictional, dramatized elements, created for reflection. If that's not something you want to hear, feel free to click away now. She spilled her orange juice. Both of her hands were shaking. I had set her breakfast out, like I always did. Plate on the left, fork on the napkin to the right. Lily reached across the table for something, and her elbow clipped the glass. It fell, bouncing once on the tile before I caught it. Most of the juice was already on the floor. It wasn't the spill that stopped me. It was her face. She was staring down the hallway. Her hands were pressed flat against the table. Her fingers were splayed wide. The way a child braces themselves when they expect something loud to happen. Her teddy bear was tucked under her left arm, and she was gripping it so hard, the fabric of its ear was crushed. "Lily," I said, putting the glass in the sink. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stayed locked on the entrance to the hallway. "Sweetie," I said again, softer this time. "Look at me." She looked at me then, and I saw something in her face I was not prepared for. Not sleepiness. Not the usual early morning crankiness of a 5-year-old. What I saw was the careful, concentrated stillness of a child who was trying very, very hard not to cry. I crouched down next to her chair. "What happened, honey?" She leaned toward me slowly, dropping her voice to little more than a whisper. The way kids whisper when they are genuinely terrified, rather than just playing a secret game. "He came into my room," she said. I felt my breathing slow down. "Who?" "Lily." She looked at the hallway again. "Richard," she said. "He came in when it was dark. He stood next to my bed for a long time. And he went through my drawer. The one with the little key. The little key. The decorative jewelry box I kept on my dresser, where Lily sometimes liked to put her drawings. She had decided it was her treasure box." My chest tightened. I kept my voice very steady. "Did he say anything to you?" Lily shook her head. "He was quiet. He thought I was asleep. But you weren't." "I was awake," she said. And then she looked at me with those brown eyes that were exactly like mine, and said, "I was scared. Mommy." I have no words for what ran through me in that moment. Something between ice and fire. I opened my mouth to speak. And then I heard footsteps in the hallway. Richard appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed, moving unhurriedly, his hair slightly damp from the bathroom. He was carrying Lily's small yellow blanket folded over one arm. His expression was warm and breezy, the expression of a man with a completely clear conscience. "Good morning," he said, smiling at both of us. He held up the blanket. "I found this on the floor next to your bed. Little one. You must have kicked it off during the night." He walked over to Lily and draped it over the back of her chair, loosely wrapping it around her shoulders. She went perfectly still when he touched her. So still that I noticed it. But I told myself it was shyness. Tiredness. The usual unpredictability of toddlers in the morning. I stood up slowly. "She said you came into her room last night," I said. My voice was careful. "Avon." Richard nodded, entirely unbothered. He looked at me with an expression of gentle, patient explanation. "I woke up around 2:00 a.m. to get some water. Her door was open," which seemed strange. "I just went to check and pulled her blanket up." He paused. "I hope that's okay. I should have asked first. I'm sorry if I overstepped." He held my gaze. His eyes were steady and open. the eyes of a man who had nothing to hide. I looked at Lily. She was staring at her plate, pushing a piece of toast in a small circle with one finger. She didn't look up. I looked at Richard. He gave me a small, apologetic smile. I made a choice. Of course. I heard myself say. That was sweet of you. The tightness in my chest didn't go away. I turned back to the stove and told myself it was nothing. I told myself Lily was just tired. I told myself a good man had checked on my sleeping daughter. Exactly the way a good man should. I told myself all of this, standing at that stove with my back to both of them. I was so desperate to believe it that I almost did. She came to my door with a bag of apples. But the look on her face told me this wasn't a social call. It was Sunday afternoon. Richard had stopped by earlier and left again around 5:00 p.m., saying he had an overnight business trip. Something about a client in Milwaukee. A dinner he couldn't reschedule. He kissed my cheek at the door and told me he'd call when he got there. I stood on the porch and watched his car disappear around the corner. Then I went back inside. 20 minutes later, Claire knocked. She was holding a brown paper bag with a few red apples visible at the top. But her posture was different from the easy, unhurried way she carried herself during our first meeting. Her shoulders were set tight. Her chin was leveled. She looked like someone who had made a decision and wasn't going to reconsider it. "Thank you," I said, taking the bag. She didn't let go immediately. Her eyes scanned past me into the house, checking the living room, as if making sure no one else was there. Then she looked at me directly. "Julia," she said, keeping her voice low. "Tonight, when it gets late, I need you to bring Lily over to my house." I stared at her. What she didn't repeat herself. She just looked at me with those gray eyes. Patient and certain. "Why?" I asked. "Claire. It's Sunday night. Lily has school tomorrow. What is this about? Come through my back door," she said. "Not the front. Come over after 1:00 p.m. Bring Lily. Even if she's already asleep. Come straight up to the second floor." She paused. And then she said, the part that stuck with me the longest. "Do not turn on any lights. Do not make any noise getting here. And do not tell your father or Richard that you are coming." I felt a cold chill wash over me. My father. She had said my father. Not Robert. Your father. As if she already knew exactly who he was. This is crazy. "Claire," I said. "You have to know how crazy this sounds." "I do," she said. She said it without an ounce of apology. "But when you get there, you'll understand why I asked." She handed me the bag of apples. She looked at me for a moment longer. And there was something in her expression I couldn't categorize. It wasn't pity. It wasn't alarm. It was something quieter than both. The look of someone who had seen a situation play out before and knew exactly where it was heading if nothing changed. Then she turned and walked across the yard back to her house. I stood on my porch, holding the bag of apples, watching her go. I thought about calling my dad and telling him. I thought about calling Richard in Milwaukee. I thought of a dozen reasonable explanations for what had just happened, none of which satisfied me. Claire was an elderly woman who had recently moved in next door. She was eccentric. Maybe she hadn't been impolite. But what she was asking made absolutely no sense. After I put Lily to bed that night, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was dead quiet. I spun my coffee mug in circles on the table and thought about Claire's eyes when she handed me that bag. The firmness in them. The total absence of anything resembling confusion or uncertainty. the specific nervousness of someone who isn't sure they are doing the right thing. She was sure. At 10:30 p.m. I got up from the table, walked into Lily's room, and stood over her in the dark. She was lying on her side, Teddy tucked against her stomach, breathing slowly and evenly. One little hand lay open on the pillow. I picked her up as carefully as I could. She shifted but didn't wake up, her head dropping heavily onto my shoulder. I carried her to the back of the house. I didn't turn on any lights. I unlocked the back door as quietly as possible and stepped outside. The night air was crisp and still. The yard was dark, except for the pale light coming from the house next door. I could see the second-floor window, a faint glow behind the curtain. I held my daughter tighter and walked toward it. The moment I looked up at that window, my breath caught in my throat. Claire was waiting at the back door. She opened it before I even had to knock, which told me she had been watching for me. She looked at Lily, sleeping on my shoulder, and said nothing. She just stepped aside to let us in. She guided me up the stairs in the dark. No lights, just as she had instructed. We moved slowly, my hand on the banister, Lily's weight shifting against my shoulder with every step. At the top of the stairs, Claire opened a door on the right, and I followed her into a room that smelled of cedar and old paper. The curtains were drawn, save for a narrow sliver in the center. Claire positioned herself next to the window and motioned for me to stand beside her. She moved with a precision I had no words for. The deliberate, economical movement of someone who had stood in dark rooms watching things before. "Look at your house," she said softly. "Wait." I looked. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Just the yard below, the maple tree, the porch light I had left on, the street beyond. Everything familiar and still. Lily was heavy in my arms. I shifted her to my other shoulder. And then I saw him. He came from the side of the house, not the front. Walking slowly, unhurried, not crouching. Just walking with the deliberate calm of someone who believed they weren't being watched. He wore dark clothing, his hood pulled up, in the yellow glow of the street lamp. His silhouette was clear, but his face was completely hidden in shadow. He went to the front door first. He reached out and tested the doorknob. Then he moved to the window beside it, standing close, tilting his head slightly, peering inside through the glass. My throat closed up. He moved to the side of the house, checked the side gate, tried the latch on the basement window. Then he circled around to the backyard, to the door I had walked out of less than an hour ago. He stood there for a moment, his hand resting on it. "He's not trying to open it," Claire said quietly beside me. "Watch him. He too cheats. But he doesn't push." I didn't understand what she meant. I was too terrified to understand anything, except that a man I didn't know was prowling around my house in the middle of the night, while I stood 40 feet away with my sleeping daughter in my arms. Then he stopped. He stood at the far edge of the yard and looked up. I followed his gaze, and my stomach plummeted. He was staring at Lily's window. Her curtains were drawn, but the nightlight she slept with cast a faint pink glow around the edges. He stood perfectly still, looking up. "He's been doing this every night for a week," Claire said. I turned to look at her. "Every night. From roughly 2:00 a.m. until 3:00 a.m. She kept her voice steady, as if reading from a report. "He shows up at the exact same time. He follows the exact same pattern. He leaves when the hour is up." I looked back at the yard. The figure hadn't moved from beneath Lily's window. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked. My voice came out thinner than I intended. The first night. I thought it was a coincidence. Claire said. Maybe someone checking a property. The second night. I was less sure. By the fourth night. I was certain enough. But I needed you to see it for yourself. She paused. Some things can't be told. They have to be witnessed. I watched him for another 40 minutes. He completed his circuit around the house 2 more times. He moved the exact same way each time. Methodical. Careful. Every time he passed under the street lamp. The shadow of his hood obscured his face. And I couldn't see a thing. At exactly 3:00 a.m. He stopped walking. He checked his wrist. Then he turned. Walked down the side of the house. And vanished. I stood at the window long after he was gone. My legs felt wrong. Like something structural inside them had given way. Lily shifted against my shoulder and made a small sound. I pressed my hand to the back of her head. She settled again. I have to protect her. That was the only thought I had. It filled every part of me until there was no room for anything else. I have to protect this child. I held her tighter in the dark. And I didn't let go. The police officer on the phone was polite. He was also completely useless. I called the non-emergency line at 8:00 a.m. Right after putting Lily on the school bus and walking back inside. I sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug. Explaining everything as clearly as I could. A man in dark clothing in my yard at the same time every night. A full week of it. The officer listened. I could hear him typing. I understand your concern. Mom. He said. That certainly sounds unsettling. But without evidence of an actual break-in. Property damage. Or a direct threat. There's very little action we can take at this stage. He paused. I can put a note in the system and request a patrol car, add your street to their night route. That was all I was going to get. We can increase the frequency of patrols in your area. He said. If the individual makes direct contact or attempts to enter the property. Call 911 immediately. I thanked him. I put the phone down on the table. I sat there for a while. Staring at nothing. Claire knocked at 11:00 a.m. She walked in without ceremony. Refused the coffee I offered. And sat across from me, with the specific composure of someone who had already mapped out the next steps. The police can't help us yet. She said. It wasn't a question. They said they'd increase patrols. I told her. She nodded slowly. That might deter him for a few nights. It won't solve the problem. She folded her hands on the table. What we need is his face. She looked at me steadily. I'd like to install cameras. Cameras. 3 of them. 1 on the front of the house. 1 in the back. And 1 angled to cover the side yard under Lily's window. She listed them off like someone reading a grocery list they had already memorized. If we get a clear shot of his face, the police will have something actionable. I looked at her. Do you know how to install security cameras? She gave me a small, measured look. I know how to do a lot of things. She said. Can I proceed? I said yes. I didn't know what else to say. She had the equipment in her car. That was the first thing that caught my attention when she brought it in. She hadn't gone out to buy it. It was already there. Already prepped. As if she knew before she ever knocked on my door that it would be necessary. 3 small, sealed camera boxes. A spool of cabling. A compact digital DVR. And a monitor screen. No bigger than a hardcover book. She worked fast and without asking for help. I followed her from room to room. Watching her. And what I saw was not the work of someone who once lived with a guy who knew about these things. It was the work of someone who knew. She ran the cables along the baseboards with the confidence of someone who had done it in the dark. In difficult places. Under pressure. She mounted each camera with 3 screws. Checking the angles before moving on. I couldn't help myself. "Did your husband teach you all this?" I asked. She looked over her shoulder at me. She had a small screwdriver in one hand and a cable clip in the other. She considered me for a moment the way a person weighs whether a question deserves their full answer. "I wasn't married to a cop, Yulia," she said. Then she turned back to the wall and drove the last screw in. I waited. She stepped down from the stool and straightened up, wiping her hands on her pants. Then she looked at me directly. "I retired 3 years ago," she said. 31 years with the state police. The last 14 as head of criminal investigations. The room went dead silent. I stared at her. She held my gaze without any particular expression, letting the information land, without rushing me. "Head of criminal investigations," I repeated. She nodded. "Then what are you doing living next door to me?" I asked. The question slipped out before I could stop it. For the first time since I met her, something crossed Claire's face. That was almost a smile. "The things that brought me here aren't important right now," she said. "What's important is that we know what we're dealing with." She gestured toward the monitor she had set up on my kitchen counter. "Tonight, we'll know more." She showed me how to operate the recording system in under 5 minutes. She labeled the 3 feeds with a piece of masking tape and a Sharpie front. Back. Side yard. Then she went home. I sat on the couch that night after Lily went to sleep and watched the monitor. The feeds were crisp and clear. I could see the maple tree in the backyard swaying slightly in the wind. A car driving past on the street. A moth circling the porch light. I watched until my eyes burned. I told myself I'd give it an hour and then go to bed. At 2:00 a.m. something moved on the backyard screen. I sat up straight. He was there. I ended up watching a week's worth of footage all at once. And around 3:00 a.m. my blood ran cold. It started the day after Claire installed the cameras. I reviewed the footage from every night the second Lily left for school. Sitting at the kitchen counter with the monitor nearby and a cooling cup of coffee next to me, the hooded figure appeared every single time. Same entry point through the side yard. Same deliberate circuit around the house. Same pause under Lily's window. Same departure at 3:00 a.m. Like he had a schedule to keep. I sent the clearest frames I could get to the police. The officer who answered this time was patient, but blunt. "The footage shows an individual in a public-facing area," he said, "without a visible face. And without evidence of an attempted break-in. We can't make an ID or an arrest." He recommended I keep recording. I kept recording. Claire came over every morning to review the footage with me. She watched in silence, occasionally asking me to rewind a section and play it back at half speed. She never seemed alarmed, which I found simultaneously comforting and deeply unsettling. It was the composure of someone who had seen worse things and knew how to pace herself. Lily's nightmares started that week. The first time it happened was on a Tuesday. I heard her crying at 2:30 a.m. I found her sitting up in bed with both hands over her eyes. Teddy discarded on the floor beside her. When I picked her up and hugged her, she clung to me. But she wouldn't say what she dreamed about. She just shook her head when I asked. It happened again on Thursday night. And again on Saturday. I asked her pediatrician about it. "Nightmares are common at this age," she said. "Change in routine. New people in her life. Even positive changes can disrupt sleep patterns." I nodded. Thanked her. And didn't mention the hooded man. Richard came over on Friday night and stayed until Saturday afternoon. He brought flowers and a board game Lily had mentioned wanting. The three of us spent the evening at the kitchen table playing it with exaggerated seriousness. Lily laughed until she had to hold her stomach. I watched her laugh and felt a knot loosen in my chest. That night, while reviewing the camera footage, I noticed something. The hooded figure hadn't appeared. I sat with that for a moment. Then I went back through the recordings and checked the previous Friday. Richard had stayed over that night, too. I pulled up the footage. The figure hadn't appeared that night either. I forced myself to slow down. I told myself it was a coincidence. 2 data points do not make a pattern. People skip nights for all kinds of reasons. The weather. Other obligations. The increased police patrols on the street. Maybe. But I kept digging. I made a list on a piece of paper. 2 columns. Nights, the figure appeared. Nights he didn't. I went back through every single recording since the cameras were installed, filling out the columns methodically, the way my mother used to ballot. When I was done, I sat perfectly still and stared at what I had written. The figure had appeared on 11 out of 14 nights. The 3 nights he didn't appear matched exactly with the 3 nights Richard had stayed at the house. Not approximately. Not roughly. Exactly. I took the paper to Claire. She read it expressionlessly. Then read it again. She placed it on the table between us and looked at it for a long moment. He knows, she said. What do you mean? She looked up at me. He knows Richard is in the house on those nights. That's why he stays away. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. The question is, how does he know? And the follow-up question is, why does Richard's presence make a difference to him? I didn't have answers for either question. I sat across from Claire in her kitchen, turning both questions over in my mind, coming up with absolutely nothing useful. No explanation that made the whole picture make sense. It bothered me more than I could say. I was a person who needed things to make sense. Lily cried again that night. I held her in the dark of her room for 40 minutes before she fell back asleep. When I finally laid her down, I stood over her for a long time, watching her breathe, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. The nightlight cast its pink glow around the edges of the curtains. The same glow the hooded man stood under every single night. I thought about Claire's questions on my way to the kitchen. He knows. Why does Richard's presence make a difference? I couldn't make the pieces fit. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the window and stared out at the dark backyard. Then, 3 nights later, the wind shifted. I was watching the backyard feed shortly after 2:00 a.m. when a gust of wind swept through the yard, shaking the maple tree, bending the tall grass along the fence. The hooded figure was in his usual spot under Lily's window. And for just a moment, the wind caught the edge of his hood. I sat up straight. My hand flew to the mouse. I hit pause. It was just a gust of wind. 1 second. That was all it took to shatter everything I thought I knew. I sat at the kitchen counter with my hand on the mouse, the image frozen on the screen. The hooded figure was standing under Lily's window. His head turned slightly to the left. The fabric of his hood was caught mid-flap by the wind. A fraction of a second later, it would settle back into place. But right now, in this frozen frame, the left side of his face was exposed. I clicked to zoom in. The image pixelated, then sharpened as the software adjusted. I moved the slider to increase the contrast. Just like Claire had showed me. The shadows lightened. The edges defined themselves. A jawline. A cheekbone. The curve of an ear. I zoomed in again. The face of a man in his mid-30s. Staring up at my daughter's window. His eyes were deeply sunken above hollowed cheeks. There were dark bags under them, the kind that don't come from one bad night, but from many. His mouth was pressed into a thin line. He looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in a very long time. Like someone carrying something so heavy he couldn't put it down. I knew that face. I had known it for 7 years. My hand pulled away from the mouse. I sat completely frozen for a moment, staring at the screen. Then, I picked up my phone and called Claire. She was at my door, in under 3 minutes. She looked at the screen without speaking. She leaned in, studying the image, the way she studied everything with the same calm. Total attention she brought to all things. Then she straightened up. "You know this man," she said. It wasn't a question. "That's Luke," I said. "My ex-husband." The words felt wrong, coming out of my mouth. Not because they were incorrect, but because they explained absolutely nothing. They only made the picture more confusing. "He left 2 years ago," I said. "He went overseas for work. We got divorced. I haven't seen him since." Why would he be standing outside my house every night? Why would he be staring at Lily's window? My voice had risen without my meaning it to. I pressed my fingers against my mouth and forced myself to breathe. Why would he do this? I asked again. Quieter. Claire stared at the image on the screen for another moment. Then she said, "Go back to the beginning of tonight's footage. I want to watch his entire approach." I did what she asked. We watched Luke circle the side of the house. Go up to the front door. Test the handle. Walk over to the front window and peer inside. Then circle back around to the back door. "Stop," Claire said. I paused the playback. She pointed. "Look. Look at his hand. On the doorknob," she said. "What is he doing?" I looked closer. Luke had his hand on the back doorknob. But he wasn't pulling. He wasn't pushing or rattling it. He was pressing something against the doorframe right next to the lock. Something small. Pressing it into place with careful, deliberate pressure. "He's adding a secondary lock," Claire said quietly. "A mechanical jam bar fitted to the exterior frame." She paused. "He brings it every night. Installs it while he's here. And removes it before he leaves." I stared at the screen. "He isn't testing the door to find a way in," she said. "He's reinforcing it to keep someone else out." The room went dead silent. I thought about the nights Luke didn't show up. The nights Richard was here. I thought about the pattern I had written in 2 columns on a piece of paper, the perfectly inverse relationship between the 2 men. I thought about Claire's words from 3 days ago. He knows Richard is in the house on those nights. That's why he stays away. He wasn't staying away because he was afraid of Richard. He was staying away because when Richard was inside, he couldn't reinforce the locks from the outside without being seen. He was staying away because he wasn't trying to threaten this house. He was trying to protect it from Richard. The thought arrived, fully formed. And with it came something I had no name for. Not exactly fear. Not exactly comprehension. Something in between the two. A cold, disorienting space where everything I had believed for the last 2 weeks no longer held its shape. Claire was still watching the screen. "Why?" I said. "Why would Luke be protecting this house from Richard? They've never met. He's been out of the country for 2 years. How would he even know about Richard?" Claire turned to look at me. Her expression was guarded. "I think," she said, "that your ex-husband knows something about Richard that you don't." I stared at the frozen image on the screen. Luke's exhausted, determined face under the streetlight. The face of a man who had stood in the freezing cold in the middle of the night for weeks. doing something nobody asked him to do. For a child who didn't even know he was there. He wasn't trying to get in. He was making sure nobody else could. My hands were shaking as I picked up my phone. I dialed his number for the first time in 2 years. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His voice on the recording was exactly the way I remembered it. Low and unhurried. He always spoke like someone who felt no need to fill the silence. "Hey. You've reached Luke. Leave a message." I didn't leave a message. I didn't know what to say. I placed the phone face down on the counter and stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then I turned back to where Claire was still studying the monitor. "Play it again," I said. "From the beginning." She did. We watched Luke's entire circuit in silence. He rounded the side of the house. Walked up to the front door. Tested the handle with that same precise, non-destructive touch. Claire had noticed. He went to the front window. Checked the side gate. Circled back to the rear. This time, I watched his hands instead of his face. Claire was right. At the back door. He pressed the secondary jam bar into place, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times. At the basement window. He did something I hadn't caught before. He crouched down and ran his fingers along the bottom edge of the frame. Checking the seal. Making sure it hadn't been disturbed. "He's inspecting the entry points," Claire said. "Every night. He's checking to see if anything he set the night before was tampered with." The implication of that settled over me slowly. He wasn't just protecting the house. He was checking to see if someone had tried to break in while he was gone. "Go to the footage from last Thursday," Claire said. I scrolled back. Claire leaned forward. "There," she said. Pause. On the screen. Luke had stopped at the corner of the house near the electric meter. He was holding something in his hand. A small, rectangular device about the size of his palm. He was moving it slowly along the exterior wall at window height. "What is that?" I asked. Claire looked at me. "An RF scanner," she said. "A radio frequency scanner. It detects wireless transmission signals." I didn't understand for a moment. And then I did. "Someone planted a listening device in my house," I said. The words came out dry. Like I was reading them off a page. She walked into the living room without another word and stood by the window for a moment. Her back to me. When she turned around, something in her expression had changed. "That device we found in the smoke detector," she said. "Luke's scanner would have picked up its transmission signal from outside. He knew it was in there. He's known for a while." She picked up her phone from where it still sat on the counter between us and looked at it one more time. Then she set it back down. "He was listening," I said. "Everything. Every conversation in this hallway. Every time I called my bank. Every time I talked to my dad. Every time Lily spoke." Claire nodded quietly. I covered my mouth with my hand. I thought about the nights Richard sat in my living room, asking careful, casual questions about my mother's estate. About the safe in my bedroom. About where I kept important documents. He asked the questions gently, framing them as interest. The natural curiosity of someone building a future with a person. And I answered. I answered everything. And somewhere in my smoke detector, a bug was broadcasting every single word. I looked at Claire. "Luke knew about it," I said. She nodded. "He was sweeping for it. Whether he found it or just detected the signal. He's known about it for a while." For a while. While I was pouring Richard coffee and thanking him for checking on my daughter, Luke was standing outside in the dark with an RF scanner, methodically sweeping the perimeter of my house. Trying to protect information I didn't even know was being stolen. I sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because I planned to. My legs simply decided they were done. Claire stood quietly in the kitchen and let me sit there. She didn't offer false reassurances. Nor did she rush me. She had the specific patience of someone who had sat with people during the worst moments of their lives and knew that some things just take a minute. I thought about Lily crying in the night. Her still frozen face at the breakfast table. The way she went completely rigid when Richard draped that blanket over her shoulders. She knew something was wrong. She tried to tell me. And I chose not to listen. My phone vibrated on the counter above me. I reached up without standing and looked at the screen. Luke. I pressed accept and put the phone to my ear. The line was dead silent for a moment. Then he said my name. Just once. With a voice that sounded like someone who had waited a very long time to be called. Julia. I closed my eyes. Tell me everything. I said. The line was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled slowly and controlled. The way someone exhales when they've been holding their breath for far too long. I heard it the first time you called. He said. I just needed a second. Where are you? I asked. Parked on Elm Street. 2 blocks from your house. I started driving as soon as you called. He was so close. He had been 2 blocks away for weeks. Coming into my backyard in the dark. And I never knew. I didn't know whether I wanted to scream at him or cry. I chose neither. I sat on the kitchen floor, with my back against the cabinets and kept my voice as steady as I could. How long have you been back in the States? I asked. About 7 weeks. He said. 7 weeks. The cameras had been recording for 12 days. He had been here for 7 weeks. Before Claire and I even knew we had to look. Why didn't you come to the door? I asked. Why didn't you call me? Why did you do nothing but stand in my backyard in the middle of the night like a Julia? His voice was low. Not sharp. Just low, in a way that stops you. I stopped because you wouldn't have believed me. I paused. And I didn't have time to convince you. I needed to move fast. And I needed you and Lily to be safe while I did it. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth for a moment. Claire was at the kitchen window. Arms crossed. Staring out at the backyard. Giving me whatever privacy she could in a small kitchen. Who is he? I asked. The man my dad introduced me to. Who is he really? Luke was quiet for a moment. His name isn't Richard. He said. His real name is Jace Miller. He's used at least 4 other aliases before this one. I wrote the name on the back of an envelope sitting on the counter. Jace Miller. 2 words that meant nothing to me. And apparently meant everything. How do you know this? I asked. When I came back and saw you with him. Something felt wrong. He paused. The way he looked at Lily. I can't explain it right. Something in my gut just said no. So I called a friend. A lawyer who has contacts in federal records. I asked him to run the name Richard. I waited. He shook his head over the phone line. I only had a face back then. My friend has resources. It took him a few days. Claire had turned from the window and was watching me now. Her gray eyes moved from my face to the envelope where I had written the name. And back again. What did he find? I asked. He has a criminal record in 2 other states. Luke said. Fraude. Mostly. He targets women with inherited assets. Single mothers. Specifically. He moves from state to state and changes his name every time. The room tilted slightly. I placed my hand flat on the kitchen floor. The house. I said. My mother's house. The documents in my safe. Yes. Luke said. That's what he wants. Among other things. The way he said among other things knocked the air out of my lungs. Lily. I said. There was a pause that told me everything before he even spoke. There are other charges. He said carefully. From 6 years ago. In another state. Involving a child. He managed to dodge the conviction on a technicality. But the record exists. I was gripping the phone so tightly, my knuckles turned white. Claire was right beside me now. Her hand on my shoulder, firm. Grounding me. He has a key to my house. I said. Someone gave him a key. He's been coming in while I'm asleep. Lily told me he came into her room. I know. Luke said. I have footage of him using the key. The back door. Usually between 11:00 p.m. and midnight. And on the nights, he tells you he's out of town. I thought about the cocktail. The heavy sensation creeping into the edges of the room. The clean break between sitting on the couch and waking up in the morning. He drugged me. I said. I believe so. Luke said. I couldn't confirm it. But his pattern of entry is consistent with you being incapacitated. The word incapacitated dropped like a physical weight. Who gave him the key to my house? I asked. Luke was quiet. Just say it. I said. Whatever it is. Just say it. Yulia. I need you to go look at something before we talk anymore. Go to your dad's office. His home office. Why? There's a drawer on the left side of his desk. Luke said. Check what's inside it. I knew even before I went. Something in the deliberate way he said it told me that whatever I was about to find had already broken something inside him when he found it himself. Me dad. I said. Go look. Luke said gently. Then call me back. I hung up the phone. Claire was already watching me. She had heard enough. She didn't say a word. She simply stepped back. So I could stand up. And I walked out of my kitchen toward my father's house. With the name Jace Miller written on an envelope in my hand. And the worst suspicion I had ever carried settling into my chest, like something that had been there all along. He was already there when I arrived. He was sitting at a corner table with his back to the wall. Which I remembered was always how he preferred to sit. He saw me the moment I walked in. He didn't wave or stand up. He just held my gaze from across the room and waited. Like he always waited. With more patience than I ever knew what to do with. I sat down across from him. He looked worse up close than he did on the camera feeds. The dark circles under his eyes were deeper. The hollows of his cheeks more pronounced. He had lost weight. His hands wrapped around his coffee cup were rougher than I remembered. The hands of someone who had been doing manual labor in the cold. Overseas. I said. What were you doing? Construction management. He said. Infrastructure projects in South Korea. Then the Netherlands. Long hours. High pay. He said it simply. Without embellishment. I waited. I was saving. He said. Not for me. I had an account I wasn't touching. Enough for a down payment on something better than what we had. A yard with more space. A school district with better ratings for when Lily got older. He looked down at the table. I was going to come home and surprise you. 2 years of saying no to every expense, so I could say yes to one big thing. I thought about the empty chair at my kitchen table. The years interpreting his absence as abandonment. Robert told me you had met someone else. I said. Luke nodded slowly. He called me regularly while I was away. At first, the calls felt genuine. He'd give me updates on you and Lily. Then, the updates started changing. He said you were struggling. That you had told him you needed a clean break. That coming home would only make things harder for everyone. He paused. I believed him. Luke said. He was your father. I thought he knew things I didn't. A cold chill ran through me. By the time I figured out what he was doing, it was too late. The papers had already been filed. He pulled a folder from the bag next to him and placed it on the table between us. This is what my lawyer friend found when I asked him to dig into Robert's finances. It took a while to track down. The transactions were structured to look like loans. I opened the folder. Annotated bank statements. Wire transfers dating back 18 months. And a single sheet of paper with handwritten terms that made my stomach churn. He owed Richard a lot of money. Luke said. Gambling. It had been going on for years. I already knew some of it. The drawer I opened at Robert's house last night told me enough to confirm what I suspected. But seeing it laid out in black and white was different than suspecting. It was the difference between thinking a floor might give way and feeling it collapse beneath your feet. Tell me about Lily, I said. Tell me what you saw. Luke put his coffee cup down. About 2 months ago, he said. I went to her preschool at dismissal time. Robert usually brought her home, but he called to say he was running late. So I went. He stopped. She came out of the building, saw me, and ran. She hit me full force. The way she used to when she was 2. He smiled faintly at the memory. And then the smile vanished. When I picked her up, I noticed a small bruise on her wrist. I asked her what happened. I went completely still. She told me Richard made her play a game at night. Luke said. Finding keys and putting them in a bag. She said she was afraid to say no. Because he told her something bad would happen to her mommy if she did. I pressed my palms flat against the table. She was 5. I said. She is 5. He said. Yes. We sat with that for a moment. I called my lawyer friend that afternoon. Luke said. I gave him the name Richard and a description. It took him 4 days to match the face to a federal file. Jace Miller. He's operated in 3 states. The asset fraud pattern is identical every time. Single mothers with inheritances. He gains access through a trusted family member who has a financial motive to facilitate that access. He looked at me steadily. I needed to gather enough evidence for the police to act. He said. And I needed to be careful. If Jace felt threatened before we had enough, he would disappear. He's done it before. How did you find Claire? I asked. I didn't find her. Luke said. She was already there. The house next door had been empty for 8 months. When I got back to Chicago and started watching your street, I ran her plates out of habit. He paused. She's not easy to miss, if you know what you're looking for. I knocked on her door and told her what I knew. She asked me how much documented evidence I had. He shook his head. At that point, not enough. We agreed that approaching you too early, before we had something concrete, would only alert Jace and give him time to run. So we waited. We built the case first. Then Claire came to you. And she agreed to help you. She didn't agree immediately. Luke said. She asked me a lot of questions first. Then she agreed. He pulled a business card from the folder. He slid it across the table toward me. Detective Hayes. Major Crimes Unit. State Police. Hayes worked under Claire for 9 years. Luke said. He already has the file. He's just waiting for us to have enough to pull the trigger. I looked at the card in my hand. All of this. The house next door. The cameras. The RF scanner. The weeks of footage. None of it was accidental. They had built a fortress around us while I was sleeping. And they did it to keep my daughter safe. Please have a seat. Ms. Julia. Detective Hayes said. His voice told me I needed to. He was younger than I expected. Early 40s. With a tight buzz cut and the kind of calm that doesn't come from personality. but from training. He had been with the Major Crimes Unit for 11 years. Claire told me on the ride over. He had seen things most people never see, and had learned how to carry them without letting it show on his face. When he looked at me across his desk that morning, his expression was measured and precise. It was the expression of someone about to deliver information that required all his professional discipline to deliver calmly. Claire sat next to me. She hadn't asked if she could come. She simply got in the car. Detective Hayes opened a file folder on his desk. He turned it toward me. "The individual you know as Richard," he said, "has been operating under a series of false identities for approximately 11 years. His legal name, the one on his original birth certificate, is Jace Allen Miller. He's used at least 6 other names in that time." He paused. "We've confirmed activity in Florida, Georgia, and now Illinois." I looked at the file. There was a photograph clipped to the top left corner. Richard's face. But younger. Sharper. Somehow less polished. The photograph of a man who hadn't yet perfected his performance. "The pattern is consistent across 3 states," Hayes said. "He identifies women who have inherited significant assets, typically real estate or liquid savings. He establishes a relationship through a trusted third party. Someone with a pre-existing financial motive. To facilitate access. He gains proximity to the home and initiates the process of stealing documents." He paused. "In 2 of the 3 prior cases, there were also children in the home." The air in the room shifted. "Those children..." I started. And then couldn't finish the sentence. "In 1 case, there was enough evidence for charges," Hayes said carefully. "In the other, the family refused to cooperate with the prosecution." He looked at me steadily. "Both children received psychological support afterward." I looked at Claire. She was staring at the desk in front of her. "The listening device recovered from your smoke detector," Hayes continued, "is consistent with commercially available covert surveillance hardware. We've logged it into evidence. Combined with the driveway camera footage of unauthorized entry that Mr. Luke compiled over the last 7 weeks. We have documented a minimum of 3 counts of breaking and entering." He paused. "The fact that he used a key provided by a third party does not reduce the criminality of the entry. He did not have your permission. That is what matters legally. He used a key my dad gave him." I said. "Yes," Hayes said. He kept his voice completely neutral on that point. He flipped to a second section of the file. "Bank records." I recognized the format from the documents Luke had shown me at the coffee shop. But these were official copies. Stamped and annotated in the margins. "We obtained these under a financial investigation warrant this morning," Hayes said. "Your father's primary account shows a series of structured deposits over a 14-month period. The final settlement received 6 weeks ago represents the full discharge of a debt incurred through gambling losses." He let me read the number at the bottom of the page. "In exchange for this discharge, your father provided Jace Miller with access to your property. This included a copied key and detailed information about the contents and location of your mother's estate documents." I read the number again. Then I set the paper down. "He sold us out," I said. The words came out very quiet. "He sold his daughter and his granddaughter to clear a gambling debt." Hayes didn't offer condolences or contradictions. He simply let the statement hang in the air. "What happens now?" I asked. "We are close to having enough grounds for simultaneous indictments against both individuals," Hayes said. "We need 2 things. First, we need Jace Miller to make one more unauthorized, documented entry, so we have him on video on your property. Without permission. In real time." He looked at me carefully. "We would like your cooperation to facilitate this." "You want to set a trap?" I said. We want to be present when he returns. Hayes said. Which we believe he will do. He hasn't secured what he came for yet. Your mother's will and the property deed are still in your safe. Until he has those documents. He has a motive to return. I nodded slowly. The second thing. Hayes said. And his voice shifted slightly. He leaned forward. Yulia. I would like you to take Lily to see someone. A colleague of mine. A child psychologist who specializes in trauma response in young children. He held my gaze. Based on what Mr. Luke described. And based on the duration and nature of Jace Miller's contact with your daughter. I believe it is critical to understand what Lily has experienced. How critical? I asked. Though I already knew the answer. He said it straight. The way someone says a hard thing when they've learned that softening it only delays the pain. Critical enough that I would ask you to go today. If you can. Claire placed her hand over mine on the arm of the chair. I looked at Hayes. I looked at the file on his desk. I looked at the younger face of Richard in the photograph. The face of a man who had done this before. Intended to do it again. And had chosen my daughter to be part of it. I understand. I said. I stood up. Thanked him. And walked out of that building, to go pick up my little girl. The child psychologist spoke in a calm, steady voice. I gripped the arms of the chair until my knuckles turned white. Her name was Dr. Sarah Allen. She had an office on the 3rd floor of a building in Oakbrook. With soft lighting. A sand-colored couch. And no sharp corners anywhere in the room. The kind of office designed so that a child walking in for the first time wouldn't feel afraid. There were low shelves along one wall with small figurines and miniature animals arranged in careful clusters. A sandbox in the corner. Crayon drawings, taped at a child's eye level on the window frame. Not framed or mounted. Just casually taped up the way a person pins something up, because it matters to them. Rather than because they want it to look a certain way. The room was saying something to anyone who entered it. It was saying, you are allowed to be small here. You are allowed to need things. Lily looked at everything with those careful, evaluating eyes. The same look she had given Richard on the first afternoon he came to our house. Then she looked at Dr. Allen, who was sitting cross-legged on a floor cushion with a tray of colored pencils arranged in front of her. And Lily walked over and sat down next to her without being asked. I watched this through the small window in the door. Then went to sit in the waiting room. I didn't move for 45 minutes. I have been through hard things in my life. The day my mother was diagnosed. The day I signed the divorce papers. The night I found out what Robert had done. But the 45 minutes I spent in that waiting room while my 5-year-old daughter talked to a stranger about things she was too terrified to tell me were some of the hardest I've ever lived through. I didn't read the magazines next to me. I didn't look at my phone. I sat with my hands in my lap and waited. There was a woman across the waiting room. She had a boy of maybe 7 next to her. Leaning against her arm. Wearing headphones and watching something on a tablet. She and I didn't speak. We didn't make eye contact. But at some point, she reached over and fixed the collar of the boy's jacket with one hand. The quick, automatic gesture of a mother doing what mothers do without thinking. And something in that tiny movement tore open a space in my chest that I had kept locked down all morning. I pressed my fingers against my sternum. Breathed. And stared at the ceiling until the feeling passed. Dr. Allen came out at 2:30. She sat across from me. Folded her hands. And looked at me the way doctors do when they have practiced what they are about to say. Good news first. She said. There is no evidence of direct physical abuse. Based on my conversation with Lily and my observations during our session, I am confident in that assessment. I exhaled the first full breath I had taken in 3 days. However, Dr. Alan continued. There is clear evidence of what we call psychological grooming. She kept her voice even and professional. She paused between sentences to make sure I was following. The individual in question established a relationship of trust and dependency with Lily over a period of weeks. He introduced the concept of secrets, framing them initially as a special bond between the two of them. He then used that framework to give her instructions she felt she couldn't refuse. The treasure hunt game, I said. She nodded. He reframed the act of taking objects from your room as a game with rules and rewards. Doleli. She was participating in something that carried his approval and the promise of a positive outcome. She did not understand what she was actually doing. She paused. He also used fear as a control mechanism. If she told me, I said, I would disappear. Doctor. Alan nodded again. It is a technique designed to isolate the child from the only person most likely to intervene. By making the mother the consequence of disclosure. He guaranteed Lily's silence. I stared at my hands in my lap. Doctor. Alan picked up a folded piece of paper from the table next to her chair. She opened it and handed it to me. During our session, she said, I asked Lily to draw something that had scared her recently. This is what she drew. I looked at the drawing. It was a child's drawing. The way all children's drawings are. The proportions were rough. Colors were chosen by feeling rather than accuracy. But what was in it was perfectly clear. Ebil? A small figure in the bed with yellow hair. Which was how Lily always drew herself. And standing next to the bed. A tall figure with a wide, curved line for a smile. And dark shading all around the outline. A figure that was standing, not sitting. Standing very close to the bed. In the dark. While the little yellow-haired figure lay perfectly still. I couldn't speak for a moment. Doctor. Alan let me look for as long as I needed. She didn't fill the silence. She knew he was there. I finally said. She wasn't asleep. She was aware of the visits. Doctor. Alan confirmed. She was told that acknowledging them would result in harm coming to you. So. She stayed still and silent. She paused. That is a significant psychological burden for a child her age. It requires a level of self-suppression that most adults would struggle with. I thought about Lily at the breakfast table. Her shaking hands. Gripping Teddy too tight. Her eyes darting to the hallway. I had seen all of it. I had seen every single sign. And I had chosen the explanation that demanded the least from me. I'm going to tell you something. Doctor. Alan said carefully. That I want you to hear correctly. She waited until she was sure she had my full attention. What you experienced in those weeks was not negligence. It was the result of deliberate, practiced manipulation. She held my gaze. He was skilled. He has done this before. The blindness you felt was not weakness. It was the intended product of his method. I said nothing. I wasn't sure if I believed her yet. But I clung to her words the way you cling to something in the dark when you aren't sure if it's solid. What does she need now? I asked. What do I actually do when we go home tonight, Doctor? Alan leaned forward slightly. Routine. She said. That is the first and most important thing. Children who have experienced this kind of sustained fear need to feel that the structure around them is reliable. Consistent meal times. Consistent bedtimes. Consistent language from you. The same words. The same reassurances. Said calmly and frequently. She paused. She needs to hear regularly. And without drama. That she is safe. That you are there. That nothing she did was her fault. She might not be ready to receive all of that yet. Say it anyway. It will land eventually. I nodded. I was making a list in my head. I was very good at making lists. It's what I did when I was too terrified to feel. She will likely have nightmares for a while longer. Doctor. Alan said. She may regress in certain behaviors. Separation anxiety is common. She might not want you out of her sight. She paused. Let her stay close. Do not try to rush her back into independence right now. Proximity is the medicine. I thought of the nights Lily crawled into my bed, pressed her face against my shoulder, and gripped Teddy so hard. His ear crushed. I had been telling myself it was just a phase. Just kid stuff. It was a child begging for help the only way she knew how. How long will she need therapy? I asked. Doctor. Alan said every child was different. But that she was young and had a strong attachment to me. Those are significant protective factors. We caught this early. She looked at me steadily. The outcome could have been much worse. I knew what she meant by that. I knew exactly what she meant. She scheduled us for the following Tuesday. And the Tuesday after that. She said she would reevaluate after 6 sessions. That there was no fixed endpoint. That healing didn't run on a calendar. And that my job, in the meantime, was simply to show up consistently and let Lily lead at her own pace. I thanked her and stood up. My legs felt the way they always did after these kinds of conversations, unreliable. Like something structural had been quietly rearranged while I was sitting there. Before you go, Doctor, Alan said from where she was still seated. I turned around. She looked at me. She had the expression of someone who had one more thing to say. And had been deciding during our conversation whether to say it or not. She had decided. You didn't fail her. She said. You were deceived by someone who is very good at deceiving people. The distinction matters. Not just for you. She paused. Because the story you tell yourself about what happened will become part of the story Lily grows up in. If you tell yourself you failed her, she will feel that version of events in ways neither of you can fully trace. She held my gaze. Tell yourself the truth. You were scared. And you were lonely. And someone took advantage of that. And the second you understood what was happening, you did not stop until she was safe. I stood in the doorway for a moment. I didn't trust myself to answer. I nodded once. And went to find my daughter. She was in the small play area at the end of the hall, sitting on the floor with Teddy in her lap and a set of wooden building blocks arranged in front of her. She had built something low and wide. A structure with no obvious function, but with careful intention visible in the placement of every piece. When she saw me, she stood up immediately and walked over to me. Moving fast. I crouched down, and she threw her arms around my neck and clung to me. I hugged her back. I held her for a long time in the hallway outside that office. Her little arms around my neck. Teddy dangling from one of her hands. Her face pressed into my shoulder. Her slow, warm breath against my skin. I didn't say anything for a moment. I just held her the way, Doctor. Alan said, the way she needed to be held. Then I whispered into her hair. You are safe. I am right here. Nothing that happened was your fault. She didn't answer. She just held on a little tighter. I meant it as a promise. And I intended to keep it. I drove to my dad's house with the police report in my hands, and 2 years of lies in my chest. The drive took 12 minutes. I had made it hundreds of times. I knew every curve. Every traffic light. The specific way the road dipped right before the intersection at Michigan Avenue. The gas station on the corner where Robert used to stop and buy me a soda when I was little. Running errands on Saturday mornings. I drove past it without looking. I had spent enough of my life collecting memories of a man who didn't deserve them. I wasn't going to add any more. I had been there the night before. After Luke's phone call. And I found exactly what he told me I would. The drawer on the left side of the desk in Robert's home office. An accordion folder. The kind with multiple pockets. Held shut by a rubber band. Inside it. 14 months of bank statements with certain transactions circled in red ink. As if Robert was tracking his own guilt. A handwritten agreement on 2 sheets of yellow legal paper. Unsigned but initialed at the bottom of each page. And a number at the bottom of the last page that made me stand perfectly still in the middle of my father's office for a long time before I could move again. I took photos of everything with my phone and left. I didn't touch anything else. I drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for a while. Then I went inside. Checked on Lily. And stood over her in the dark of her room while she slept. I forced myself to feel everything I needed to feel before morning. Because after morning, I would need to be very clear-headed. And very cold. I stood over my daughter for a long time. The nightlight cast its pink glow around the edges of the curtains. She had one hand open on her pillow. And Teddy tucked under her chin. The soft, unguarded face that only sleep produces. The expression of someone who doesn't yet know everything the world is capable of. I looked at her. And I thought about my mother. Who worked 30 years as a nurse. Saved carefully. And left everything she had to me so that Lily would be safe. So that we would never have to be afraid. My mother trusted Robert. Too. She had been gone for 3 years. And she couldn't know what he had done with that trust. I made a promise to my daughter in the dark of her room that night. Not out loud. Not in words. The kind of promise that exists entirely in the chest in the specific pressure of a decision settling into place. Now. It was morning. I was both things. Robert answered the door in his bathrobe. He looked surprised to see me. Which told me he didn't know anything had changed yet. He was still operating in the version of reality he had constructed. The version where he was a man who had made some tough choices in difficult circumstances. And where the consequences were something that happened to other people. Come in. He said. Taking a step back. I walked in. I didn't sit down. I placed the police report on the coffee table in front of him. He looked at it without touching it. What is this? He asked. It's a summary of the financial investigation into your accounts. I said. Issued this morning. You should read the part on page 3. It has your name on it twice. He didn't pick it up. He looked at me. And I watched his expression cycle through several versions of himself before settling on the one he always used when he wanted me to feel like I was the irrational one. Yulia. He said. Let me explain. I waited. I was in a difficult position. He said. You have to understand that. The debt was substantial. There were people involved who were not patient. He paused. I didn't know the full extent of who Richard was. You knew enough. I said. I knew he wanted access to the estate documents. He said. I thought it was a financial matter. I thought he'd take the papers. Make some copies. And move on. I didn't know he would hurt the child. The child. Something flared in my chest. Her name is Lily. I said. She is 5 years old. She is your granddaughter. And you gave a man with a federal criminal record the key to the house where she sleeps. I was trying to protect myself, he said. I had no choice. You had every choice. I said. You chose yourself. You always chose yourself. You chose yourself when you called Luke overseas and told him I wanted a clean break. You chose yourself when you told me Luke had someone else. You chose yourself when you brought Richard into our lives and handed him the key to our front door. His jaw clenched. I did what I had to do. You told a man where my daughter's bedroom was. I said. You told him when I would be alone. You facilitated everything that happened in that house over the last 2 months. Every entry. Every night he stood in my daughter's room while she pretended to be asleep because she was too terrified to move. Robert looked away. He looked at the window. At the middle distance. At anything that wasn't my face. I had a problem. He said quietly. I needed help. I made decisions I'm not proud of. But what was I supposed to do? I looked at him for a long moment. He was my father. I had a specific memory of him that I had carried for 30 years. A memory of being Lily's age. Sitting on his shoulders at a street fair. Being the tallest person in the crowd. Feeling entirely safe. I had spent most of my adult life trying to reconcile that memory with the man who kept replacing it with new evidence. I was tired of trying to reconcile. What you were supposed to do, I said, is exactly what you didn't do. I kept my voice very steady. You were supposed to be her grandfather. That was the only thing asked of you. And you traded it for a number on a yellow piece of paper. He opened his mouth. I'm not finished, I said. He closed it. From this moment on, I said, you are not my father. You are not Lily's grandfather. You are a defendant in a criminal investigation. And you do not contact me. You do not contact her. And you do not contact anyone in my life. If you try to reach me, I will provide the documentation to support an additional charge of harassment. Do you understand? He stared at me. His face turned the color of old paper. Julia, he said. I am your father. You were. I said. I picked up the police report from the coffee table. I reached into my purse and pulled out the cooperation form Detective Hayes had given me. The one authorizing my full participation in the sting operation against Jace Miller. And naming Robert as a co-conspirator. I placed it on my knee and signed it. He watched me sign it. He didn't say a word. The room was perfectly silent. Except for the faint sound of the television in the next room. Something he had left on before answering the door. Voices he wasn't listening to anymore. When I finished signing, I stood up and looked at him one last time. I wanted to feel something dramatic. Anger? Or grief? Or the specific relief people describe when they finally walk away from something that has hurt them for a long time. What I felt instead was a kind of indifference. The emotional equivalent of a room that had been emptied out. Not peace. Exactly. Just the absence of what had been there before. You're going to need a lawyer, I said. Not a suggestion. Just a fact. The way you state facts to someone who has run out of options. He looked at the cooperation form in my hands. Something passed across his expression that I couldn't name. And didn't try to. He was 63 years old. Sitting in a bathrobe in the house he had lived in for 20 years. And the daughter he betrayed was standing in his living room. Looking at him as if he were a stranger. Whatever he felt in that moment. He earned it. I put the form back in my purse. I walked to the door. And I left. I stood on his porch for a moment before walking to my car. The street was quiet. A dog was barking somewhere 2 houses down. Persistent and bored. The sky was the pale, washed-out blue of a Chicago morning. The kind of light that makes everything look slightly new. Whether it deserves to or not. I walked to my car and got in. I sat with my hands on the steering wheel for a moment. Lily was at Luke's lawyer's house. She was safe. She had eaten breakfast. And was probably watching cartoons. Holding Teddy. And not thinking about any of this. She was 5 years old. She was somewhere warm. And she didn't have to carry any part of what I was carrying in this car right now. That was the thing I got right. Whatever else I had failed at. Whatever warning signs I had ignored. Whatever explanations I had chosen because they demanded less courage. I got her out of there before he finished what he came to do. She was 5. and she was safe. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't cry on the way home. I had cried enough over the years for a man who never deserved a single tear. I was done with that. 2. Detective Hayes laid out the plan at Claire's kitchen table the following night. There were 4 of us. Me, Luke, Claire, and Hayes. He had a notepad and a pen. And he didn't write anything down. Which told me he had done this kind of thing enough times that the notes lived in his head. Not on paper. He spoke quietly, with the same measured precision he brought to everything. Claire sat across from him with her hands folded. Luke sat next to me. Jace Miller does not know that we know. Hayes said. He has no reason to alter his behavior. He will return tonight. Or within the next 2 nights. He still needs the property deed and the original will. Those are the documents he hasn't been able to access yet. He looked at me. You're safe. I know. I said. We are going to let him come. Hayes said. We are going to let him enter the house. And we will be there when he does. He explained the positions. 2 officers from his unit inside the house. In the back bedroom. In the dark. With the door cracked open. Hayes himself in the hallway closet. Claire monitoring the camera feeds from her house next door. With a direct line to Hayes. Luke would be at the back door outside. Just as he had been every night except tonight. Claire will have her cell phone in hand and a clear line of sight to the side yard where Jace Miller always appears. Hayes said. And me, I asked. In the house. Acting exactly as you always do. Hayes looked at me. I need the house to look occupied and normal. If you leave, he might notice. He's been watching your patterns for weeks. Claire chimed in. I'll be monitoring from next door. The moment he breaches the perimeter, you'll know. I thought about sitting in my living room, knowing a man with a federal criminal record was walking toward my back door. I thought about Lily's drawing. The tall figure with the wide, curved smile, standing next to a small bed in the dark. Where will Lily be? I asked. Luke answered. With my lawyer's family. I already dropped her off. She thinks it's a sleepover. I looked at Luke. He had arranged it without being asked. Which meant he thought of it before I did. I nodded once. And looked back at Hayes. What do I do? I asked. Sit on the couch. Hayes said. Read a book. Watch something on television. Be visible through the front window so that if he checks the house before approaching, he sees normal life inside. He paused. When Claire signals. Stay exactly where you are. Do not move toward the noise. Do not open any doors. Let us do our jobs. Understood, I understand. I said. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Claire said. He's coming tonight. I can feel it. Nobody argued with her. I went home at 9:00 p.m. I put on regular clothes. The kind a person wears when having a quiet night in. I turned on the lamp next to the couch. I put the television on low volume, a nature documentary that required no emotional investment. I sat with a book open in my lap and stared at the words without reading them. At 10:30 p.m. my phone buzzed once. A text from Claire. 1 word: perimeter. He was in the side yard. I put the book down beside me. I placed both hands on my knees. I stared at the television screen and watched a herd of something move across a plain somewhere far away. I breathed in. Deep and with deliberate care. The way you breathe when you are trying to make your body understand that panic is not an option. I heard nothing for a long time. The house was dead quiet around me. Then I heard the back door. Not a crash. Not a forced entry. A small, careful, mechanical sound. The sound of a key being inserted very slowly. The way someone inserts a key when they are trying to make absolutely no noise. The click of the deadbolt. The smooth swing of the door on its hinges. Footsteps in the hallway. Light. Measured. Confident. The footsteps of a man who had done this before. And had no reason to believe tonight was any different than the rest. I sat on the couch and did not move. The footsteps passed the entrance to the living room. I stared blankly at the television. A bird landed on a branch on the screen. Somewhere in the hallway behind me. A man who called himself Richard, whose real name was Jace Miller, was walking toward my bedroom. Toward the closet, where my safe sat on the top shelf. Toward the documents he had spent 2 months working for. I heard Hayes's voice ring out from the hallway. Clear and authoritative. State police do not move. There was a single second of absolute dead silence. Then, the sound of rapid, panicked movement. The sound of someone who had spent years on the run making the split-second calculation that running was still the best option. Then, Luke's voice from the back door. Firm and dry. Nowhere to go. More voices. Hayes again. And the other officers. The sound of a struggle that lasted less than 30 seconds. Ending with the sharp, mechanical clack of handcuffs. And then, silence. I sat on the couch. I didn't move. My hands were still resting on my knees. Hayes appeared in the doorway of the living room. He looked at me for a moment. Then said, "We got him." I stood up. My legs felt strange. As if they belonged to someone who had been perfectly still for far too long, and was only just remembering how to use them. I walked to the entrance of the hallway and looked. Richard was facing the wall. His hands cuffed behind his back. One of Hayes' officers had a hand firmly on his shoulder. His jacket was slightly torn at the seam from the brief struggle. His hair was no longer perfect. At some sound I made. Or perhaps just feeling someone behind him. He turned his head. He looked at me. And for the first time in the 2 months I had known him, I saw his face without the performance over it. Without the easy smile. The patient eyes. And the deliberate warmth he had deployed with such lethal precision. Stripped of all the carefully constructed signals that told me he was safe. Kind. And trustworthy. What lay underneath was much simpler. And much colder. He looked at me the way someone looks at an obstacle that has inconvenienced them. Then Hayes' officer turned him back around to face the wall. And they marched him out my back door. The night air drifted in cold through the open doorway. And I stood in my hallway and breathed it in. Luke appeared in the doorway a moment later. He looked at me from the other end of the hall. "It's over," he said. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. It wasn't over. Not entirely. There was still a trial ahead of us. Testimonies and documents and the long, grinding machinery of justice. But the man who had stood in my daughter's bedroom in the dark was in handcuffs now. And my daughter was in a safe house. Eating cereal. Watching cartoons. And completely unafraid. That was enough for tonight. That was everything. The courthouse was cold. The way courthouses always are. Not just the temperature. Although it was that too. A specific, institutional chill, belonging to a room with high ceilings and no softness anywhere. It was cold in the manner of a space designed specifically to bear the weight of consequences. Where the architecture itself communicated that what happened here was permanent. I arrived early. Claire offered to drive me. And Ileta. Which was unusual for me. I had always been the kind of person who needed to be behind the wheel, the one controlling the route. The timing. And the speed. But that morning, I sat in the passenger seat. Watched the city slide past the window. And said very little. Claire didn't try to fill the silence. That was one of the things I had come to appreciate about her. She knew the difference between a silence that needed to be broken and a silence that needed to be held. The courthouse was a federal building downtown. I had driven past it many times over the years without ever thinking about what happened inside. It was just a building. The way buildings are when they have nothing to do with your life yet. Now. I walked through its doors, passed through security, and headed down the corridor to the correct courtroom. Every step felt deliberate in a way ordinary steps don't. The kind of walk you do when you are acutely aware of where your feet are landing. I sat in the gallery, with Claire on my left and Luke on my right. Lily was with Luke's lawyer's family again, where she had been during the last 3 weeks of pre-trial proceedings. She knew something important was happening. She didn't know the details. Dr. Allen had advised us on what to tell her and when. And we followed her guidance to the letter. The gallery slowly filled up. There were people I didn't recognize, journalists. Maybe. Or observers from the DA's office. Or simply members of the public who followed these kinds of cases. There were 2 women sitting together near the front who had flown in from Georgia. Hayes had told me about them discreetly the week prior. One of them had a daughter. She was 11 now. I didn't look at them for too long. I couldn't afford to. Jace Miller was brought in first. He wore a suit someone had brought for him, dark gray. Well fitted. Even now. Even here. He carried himself with the specific kind of composure I recognized as a performance. He sat at the defense table and folded his hands in front of him. At some point during the proceedings, he turned around and looked at the gallery. And when his eyes found me, he smiled. It was the same smile he wore on the first afternoon he walked through my front door. Easy. Silver. The smile of someone who had spent so much time performing warmth that he no longer knew where the performance ended. I held his gaze and didn't look away. Luke shifted slightly beside me. He didn't say anything. He just placed his hand on the armrest between us. Not touching my arm, just near. Present. It was enough. The charges were read aloud by the clerk in a flat, unhurried drone. Breaking and entering. 3 counts. Illegal use of a recording device. 1 count. Fraude. In connection to the estate process. 2 counts. Child endangerment. 1 count. Conspiracy to commit financial fraud. 1 count. And the federal charge that carried the most weight. The one Hayes had explained to me in his office 3 weeks earlier. Grooming and enticement of a minor, in violation of federal statutes. 1 count. To festu every charge read. Jace Miller's attorney pleaded not guilty. It was a formality that wouldn't hold up. The camera footage was too clear. The financial records were too complete. Dr. Allen's expert testimony regarding Lily's psychological state was too precise. After 4 days of proceedings, the jury was out for 6 hours. I spent those 6 hours in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the courthouse with Claire. We didn't talk about the case. We talked about small things. The way people do when they are carefully filling time. She told me about the house she grew up in, a small place outside Milwaukee. A backyard with a pecan tree she used to climb. I told her about my mother's kitchen. The smell of cinnamon on Sundays. We didn't mention the jury room. The 12 people inside. Or the immense weight of what they were deciding. There was nothing left to do about it. It was completely out of our hands. A fact I kept turning over in my mind like a stone I was trying to find the smooth side of. When Hayes called, I set my coffee cup down and answered on the first ring. They came back with guilty on all counts. I sat perfectly still as the jury, 4-person, read the verdict. Claire placed her hand over mine. I thought I would feel something massive when it came. Relief. Or triumph. or the dramatic liberation that justice is supposed to produce in the people who wait for it. What I felt was much quieter than that. Something that settled instead of exploding. The specific quiet of a door closing on something that had been open for a very long time. Letting cold air into a room you had stopped noticing was freezing. Robert was sentenced separately. In a different courtroom. On a different morning. I went to that one. Too. With Hayes by my side. Robert had taken a plea deal. Which reduced his sentence, but didn't eliminate it. His lawyer argued that his gambling addiction was a disease. That his culpability was mitigated by his cooperation with investigators after his arrest. The judge listened to all of it with the deadpan attention of someone who had heard many similar arguments. 7 years. The judge said. Maximum security. Ineligible for early parole for the first 4. Robert turned to look at me as they led him away. I don't know what he expected to find on my face. Whatever it was. I didn't give it to him. I looked at him the way you look at something you are completely finished with. And then I looked away. That was the last time I saw my father's face. In the weeks following Robert's sentencing, the letters started arriving. They came from the state penitentiary where he was being held. Addressed in his handwriting on the outside of the envelope. I received 6 of them over 2 months. I didn't open a single one. I placed each one in an envelope and mailed it to Hayes' office. Into the file labeled with Robert's name. As proof of continuous contact. His lawyer received a letter from mine, stating that any further communication would be treated as harassment. The letters stopped after that, on the day Jace Miller was sentenced. I stood in the gallery and listened to the judge read the pre-sentencing report. The prior incidents in Florida and Georgia. The children in those homes. The families who tried to move on from something you can never completely move on from. The judge's voice was measured and deliberate. And when he reached the sentencing recommendation, he paused for a moment the particular way judges do before saying something final. 22 years. The judge said. Federal prison without the possibility of parole. Mandatory registry as a sex offender upon release. With lifetime monitoring. Jace Miller didn't say a word. His lawyer didn't say a word. Then, Jace Miller turned around and looked at the gallery one last time. His expression wasn't the blank coldness I had seen in my hallway on the night of his arrest. It was something I didn't have a clear name for. Not exactly anger. Not exactly defeat. The expression of a man who had spent his entire life calculating the odds. Who had always found a way to make the numbers work in his favor. And who was standing in the very first room where the numbers had finally turned against him. He opened his mouth. Whatever he intended to say didn't come out as words, just a sound. Then, his lawyer touched his arm. He closed his mouth. The bailiffs moved in. And they led him out of the courtroom through the side door. And he was gone. I sat there for a moment after the room started emptying out. The crowd vanished. I thought about the very first afternoon he stood in my entryway. Looking at the photographs on my wall. The ceramic pot of succulents on the windowsill. Asking questions that felt genuine. I thought about how good he was at it. How practiced. How completely I believed in the thing he was performing. I thought about Lily showing him her drawings scattered across the coffee table. Lily grabbing his hand to pull him into the backyard. Lily on the swing. Yelling for me to see how high she was going. While he stood at the edge of the yard, with that expression, I mistook for genuine presence. I thought about all the things I wouldn't let myself think about. And then, on et bien, I let them go. The way you let go of something you've been gripping so tightly for so long that your hand has forgotten how to open. Claire stood up and gathered her things with the silent efficiency she brought to everything. Hayes met my eye from across the room and gave me a single nod. The nod of a man who had seen a long process reach its end. And was satisfied with the outcome. I stood up and walked out of the courtroom into the hallway. The light out there was different from the light inside. Warmer. Les institutionnels. I stopped for a moment and just stood in it. Luke was waiting by the elevators. He hadn't come into the courtroom. He had offered. And I told him I needed to do this part alone. He understood without asking why. He looked at me now from across the hallway. He didn't say anything. He simply opened his arms. I walked toward him. And when I reached him, I stopped trying to hold myself together, which I had been doing for 2 months. And which had required more effort than I ever knew I possessed. I let everything I was carrying unravel all at once. Standing in the hallway, outside a federal courthouse. With my forehead pressed against my ex-husband's shoulder. His arms wrapped around me. The long, exhausting work of survival was finally done. He held me until I was ready to let go. We stood there for a while. People walked past us in the corridor. Someone's phone rang. Somewhere down the hall. A door opened and closed. The ordinary world carried on at its ordinary pace. Indifferent to the fact that something massive had just ended inside a room 30 feet away. When I finally pulled back, I didn't feel the way I expected to feel at the end of something like this. I had imagined, in the months of waiting and preparing and holding my ground, that the ending would feel like an arrival. Like standing at the summit of something and being able to see in every direction. What I actually felt was much simpler than that. It felt like putting down a weight I had carried for so long that I had stopped noticing its shape. Not triumph. Not closure. Just the quiet, ordinary sensation of my hands being empty. And the slow realization that they could now hold something else. Claire appeared beside us. She looked at me for a moment. Then said simply, "Good." And turned toward the exit. Hayes shook Luke's hand. Then mine. He said he would be in touch about the paperwork. The final records. The procedural remainder of things. His voice was equal parts professional and warm. The voice of a man who cared about the outcome. But understood that the outcome is never quite the ending people imagine it to be. Then it was just Luke and me in the hallway. And the afternoon outside. The tall windows were bright and ordinary. And somewhere in the city, our daughter was sitting in someone else's kitchen. Eating something she liked. Holding Teddy. Completely unafraid. So, we went to pick up our daughter. Looking back, I understand now that the deepest wound didn't come from a stranger. It came from my own father. A family betrayal so calculated, so cold, that I almost didn't survive it. I was blind. I was lonely. And I let that loneliness make decisions that nearly cost my daughter everything. Don't be like me. Do not let the silence of an empty house convince you that anyone willing to fill it deserves your trust. Loneliness is not a reason to lower your guard. That is exactly when you need to raise it the highest. The people who want to harm you rarely arrive looking dangerous. They arrive looking like answers. My personal belief is simple. Tolerating a traitor is a betrayal to everyone who truly loves you. The moment you uncover a family betrayal of this magnitude, the only just response is cold. Deliberate. Unapologetic clarity. Protecting your child is not cruelty. It is the most sacred thing you will ever do. I also believe that God does not abandon the people who fight for their children. He placed Luke 2 blocks away in the dark. He moved Claire into the house next door at the exact right moment. What felt like a coincidence was something entirely different. This family revenge wasn't mine to carry alone. And I never had to. This story was agonizing to live through. But if it saves even one mother from making the choices I made, then it was worth telling. That is the only family revenge that truly lasts, not the punishment, but the truth. And the truth. No matter how brutal the family betrayal that preceded it, always finds its way to the light. If this story moved you, Leave a comment below, and let me know what part stuck with you the most. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that these stories matter, subscribing is the easiest way to ensure you never miss one. Thank you so much for staying until the end. It means more than I can say.